What were the origins and context for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints quasi-canonical document, the Family Proclamation to the World? My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American religion and author of the book American Zion, A New History of Mormonism. And any scholar who looks at modern Mormonism and tries to engage its teachings and practices and ideas concerning gender has to wrestle with the Proclamation on the Family, as it's colloquially known. However, within the Latter-day Saint tradition, the document is treated with, as I mentioned, quasi-canonical scriptural status. It's meant to transcend its era in order to speak to eternal truths. It declares that gender is an eternal characteristic of children of God, that marriage between man and woman is a divine institution, and it calls on governments to support what it calls traditional family. It has been used, therefore, as a blueprint for the church's opposition to same-sex marriage, first into legal struggles during the 1990s and 2000s, and then later on to internal struggles in the last decade or so. But in writing my book, American Zion, it became very clear that the document, far from being a prescient or one might call prophetic, speaking toward a future era, it was a product of its particular time. So in this video, I want to talk about the three primary contexts or cultural trajectories that led to the Proclamation on the Family being issued in September of 1995. The first will be internal debates over gender by members of the church. The second will be external influences as the LDS Church starts affiliated with the Religious Right Coalition. And third is the legal disputes over same-sex marriage. Let's dig in. Now, the 1970s were a period of cultural tumult across the American nation. There were lots of disputes and movements and protests over gender, racial, class, inequality. And those external agitations influenced the Latter-day Saint tradition. In fact, in the early 1970s, there were two prominent LDS protest movements that had substantial impact on the Mormon tradition. The first was the fight for racial equality and the Genesis group of Black Latter-day Saints who fought for more Black inclusion and even priesthood ordination for Black men and access to temple worship for women. They formed the Genesis group in 1971, and then a year later, a group of Mormon feminists formed the Exponent 2 group. Within a decade, one of those groups get what they hoped for. In 1978, when the racial restriction was rescinded by LDS President Spencer W. Kimball. And while that 1978 proclamation or declaration that ended the racial restriction may seem as an odd precursor to the Proclamation of the Family, I'd argue it's quite significant, because when the LDS Church was able to walk back on what had been considered a pillar doctrine or a cornerstone teaching in the church, including on the topic of priesthood, it raised questions on what else might they be able to change. And there were a lot of these feminists within the Mormon tradition who argued that the next step in Mormonism's evolution, now that they've tackled the racial inequality, was to tackle the gender inequality. So you have widespread movement of Mormon feminists in the 1970s and 80s arguing for more women's equality. This included the Exponent 2 sisters that I mentioned before. They originated in Boston and soon became nationwide, who argued for a much more moderate form of merging feminism with Mormonism, as well as more radical agitators, those who were calling for women's ordination. And we get some of the most powerful and new arguments for women's ordination during the 1980s. Soon, LDS authorities saw this as a threat, and we saw a crackdown on those feminists, especially outspoken feminists, resulting in part in the September 6 excommunications, when 6 prominent Mormon intellectuals were punished, many of whom were punished for their writings on gender and calling for women's ordination. Because in stepping back on their racial restriction, the LDS Church felt, especially their authorities, felt added anxiety to reaffirm other fundamentals to show they weren't changing too much. And so by the 1990s, the LDS Church was dedicated to trying to push back on this argument for gender equality, women's ordination, and challenges to what they called traditional gender roles. That internal agitation was not the only, or perhaps even the primary, form of influence on the LDS Church during those decades, because this same time period, the 1970s to the early 1990s, also witnessed the rise of what scholars call the religious right, an interdenominational evangelical conservative coalition aimed to fight back on what they saw as too much progressivism or secularism or erosion on traditional values. These were a lot of religious denominations under the fundamentalist umbrella that had previously saw each other as rivals with denominational and theological squabbles, but now were willing to put aside all those divisions to form a coherent movement that could oppose their true villains in their mind, which was secularism and progressivism. Now, it could have very easily been the case that Mormons could have also been the target of this group. Mormons have never been allowed at the evangelical table, and there was definitely a rise in anti-cult rhetoric within these evangelical movements, including among the religious right. This is when the God Makers documentary and show became prominent, was being shown to tens of thousands of evangelicals across America. But there are other evangelical leaders of this religious right movement, like Jerry Falwell, who argued that actually Mormons provide a potential ally in this quest, because while they're theological distant from us, they share our same political and cultural values, at least if the church could prove that they do so. And one of those key issues in this evangelical religious right push was the family and fighting back against feminism and women's equality. And so Mormons were able to prove that they could belong within that coalition by also tamping down against gender equality movements within their own ranks. And you can see how this became a potent tool across the different denominations, because in the 1990s, in fact, the very same year we had the Proclamation on the Family in the LDS tradition, the Interdenominational Christian Coalition issued their contract on the family. And then after years of discussion, the Southern Baptist Convention issued their statement on the family. So you see how the family became a political talking point, and the LDS contribution to that discussion fit within that larger trajectory. But then there's one final context that's related to the others that definitely played a crucial role, and that was the growing legal battle over same-sex marriage. Now, there had been a gay rights movement in America for several decades by the 1990s, starting with the Stonewall riots in the late 1960s. But by the 1980s and 90s, that gay rights movement had made some victories, and states like Hawaii was now openly questioning whether they should rescind their state laws that denied same-sex couples the rights of marriage. And in fact, during the 1990s, you see a number of states adding to their state constitution an anti-gay right amendment. And there were some who saw that this was going to be the next major battleground in the culture wars. And among those who recognized this and tried to capitalize it was Dallin H. who was a Utah State Supreme Court justice, so therefore aware of the rules, and also joined the LDS Quorum of the 12 Apostles in 1984. And mere months after joining the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, he authored a memo that I argue is one of the most important, if little known, documents in modern Mormonism. And in that memo, Dallin H. argued that gay marriage should be the point that the LDS Church needs to focus on, that they should stop focusing on these other political issues. We need to define the same-sex marriage issue as a moral issue, and we need to put all our eggs in that basket opposing that front. And that memo really stakes out the parameters of Mormon Church's political involvement over the next few decades. And so when Hawaii has a legal proceedings in the mid-1990s over same-sex marriage, the LDS Church was able and willing to jump in and joining with other churches. As early as February of 1994, LDS authorities are encouraging members of the state to reach out to their local politicians to urge them to support traditional marriage. And then that fall, we get the origins of the proclamation. So according to a biography of Dallin H that came out just a few years ago and had access to both Dallin H through interviews as well as access to his personal journals, it was revealed that in December of 1994, Boyd K. Packer, who was then president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, created a committee that included Dallin H Russell M. Nelson, and another apostle to draft what he called a scripturally based statement defending the family. In Oakes's telling, it was Russell M. Nelson, who is now the LDS Church president, but was then a junior apostle, who authored most of that document, although there has long been speculation that lawyers were also having a hand in it. The immediate context, of course, was they were trying to provide a legal reasoning showing that opposing same-sex marriage was a doctrinal pillar and more crystal and clear ideas than could be found in the LDS corpus of scripture, which is why the Proclamation on the Family was given quasi-canonical status. But it also reflected all these other trajectories leading to that moment. They're responding to decades of Mormon dissidents arguing for women's ordination. They're trying to prove to the religious right that they can be faithful allies in the fight over the family. And now they're adding a document that they can use in the legal proceedings over same-sex marriage. So while we don't know the extent of other people who were consulted on the formation of the Proclamation on the Family, we do know who wasn't consulted, and that was the presidency of the Relief Society, the women's organization in the church. And we know this because Chiko Okazaki, a wonderful counselor in the Relief Society presidency at the time, later said that they were surprised when it was presented to them saying that, hey, we're going to present this at the next General Conference in 1995, and we would like to present it at the women's session. The irony, the sad irony, is that the Relief Society presidency had planned for that session to focus on the diversity of the Mormon women's experience. And here was a document that is trying to homogenize how gender roles operate within the family. Chiko Okazaki also mentioned that she wishes they had a chance to revise the document because they had some problems with it, which again fits into the story of these documents being crafted by the male leaders and women not being consulted. So there you have it. That's the general background, origins, and at least three primary contexts through which the LDS Proclamation on the Family, formerly known as the Family, a Proclamation of the World, should be understood. It is hard to overstate the significance of this document in shaping Latter-day Saint ideas concerning the family, gender, and marriage. And while Latter-day Saints today believe that that proclamation reflects a long-standing tradition that has already been around eternities on end, in reality, that document was a snapshot of a particular moment in American culture, now crystallized as quasi-scripture. Let me know if you have any questions. If you find this useful, please share this video with others. And also please follow this channel if you like more historical context.